Unisa lecturer Mametlwe Sebei has written an opinion piece slamming the ANC-led government on Eskom's disastrous state. He joins us now to give a background on his dissatisfaction and what he believes should be done better by both the Eskom board and National Treasury. Good evening, sir, and thank you very much for your time and joining us tonight on In Focus.
Good evening to you and to your viewers.
So, one would read your piece, understand the context in which you're writing it, but also take you back to what you said earlier on in the year when you were calling for the national shutdown, this time as the president of Unisa, and say, are you not, in a sense, asking for one thing in the one hand and then slamming it on the other hand? Because you previously, of course, said during the marches that the situation at Eskom is worsening. In fact, load shedding currently being imposed on the poor is unacceptable, and decisions need to be taken. You were slamming the tariff hike, and you're saying it must be absolutely rejected, and the ANC government must do something about it. They are saying, okay, we're going to do something about it, declare state of disaster. You are saying, no, don't do that. You guys just want to please your white monopoly capital masters. Which one do you actually want? Do you want them to do something about it, or you don't want them to do something about it?
So let us be very clear. Eskom and the energy situation in the country is a state of disaster that has been manufactured by the ANC, years of mismanagement, corruption, the incompetence, and of course, the fact that their neoliberal policies means that, Eskom is actually, at the mercy of coal industry and other suppliers that are swindling it. That is the reality of the situation. What the declaration of the state of emergency entails, it does not entail that government would, of course, appreciate the agency of the situation. What it does in its legal technical meaning, as defined in the Disaster Management Act, it means that government acquires emergency powers. Now, I studied that act to understand what does this actually introduce in the whole situation. First and foremost, the act says the only time that the minister by notice in a government gazette can introduce, can declare a state of disaster, it is when the existing laws and contingency plan do not make an adequate provision for the executive to be able to address that particular state of disaster that the situation warrants. Now, what does this mean? It can only mean that the government says the environmental laws that we have in terms of NEMA, MPRDA, the tendering, regulations that are in place, and all of that are inadequate. Because the only powers that in this situation would be invoked is the powers of the minister to introduce emergency procurement procedures. And we have to ask ourselves, is that the problem that we have at Eskom? Is that the solution that will address the problem at Eskom? And I'll say this, the problem at Eskom is not the regulatory and the legal framework. The problem at Eskom is a flagrant disregard and flouting of those regulations. It is what has landed us in terms of the disaster with regard to load shedding, but also and astronomical levels of debt that has paralyzed Eskom.
Yeah. SIU says, when I spoke to them earlier in the week, that even under emergency procurement, there are processes and procedures in place that must be followed. Emergency procurement does not mean you must now register a company yesterday and be granted a tender tomorrow. And you must be a car wash and then tomorrow become an engineering company. It doesn't say that. There's nothing that says that in emergency procurement. Even in emergency procurement, there are certain processes that must be followed, applications and oversight that must be conducted. So they're arguing that it's not true that emergency procurement means people can just run roughshod and steal however they like.
But here's the thing. Then, if you are saying the problem is, that you still intend to follow certain processes, there's still going to be transparency and accountability. What then do you mean? Because, as I say, the Disaster Management Act is very clear. The only time, so the existence of the disaster on and by itself is not a sufficient legal basis to justify a declaration of the state of disaster for the purpose of acquiring and investing in the executive emergency powers. The only way is that you are saying the existing laws are not adequate. Now, if you are saying transparency and all those, if you like, regulations that I would assume they are saying that create bottlenecks in the process are going to be followed, why then invest or why introduce emergency procurement procedures? The reality is, even those normal procedures are what has landed us in this problem. The cases which has resulted in load shedding of, about 2,000 hours last year, right? About a debt which is going to cost Eskom just to service it in terms of, interest rates and debt repayment, about 189 billion just in the next coming 5 years, just in terms of the interest and those portion of the debt that become due of the overall debt of 396.3 billion. And we need to ask ourselves, how did we get to this amount of unsustainable debt? It is because, you see, when UDP was sold, we were told it was going to cost something like about 160-something billion. That was in 2007. Both Medupi and Kusile have overrun the budget by 300 billion because of the flagrant disregard, the flouting, the corruption that is related with tendering at those particular power stations during the constructions and beyond. So we are saying, or rather I'm saying, we need more transparency. We need more accountability. In fact, my argument is that there must be complete insourcing of the capacity.
Yes.
I'm arguing that the coal mining must be nationalized, must be brought under public ownership, because part of the problem that we are having in Eskom is that Eskom is entering into this relationship with the coal industry that are swindling it. We have a situation where, for instance, some of its biggest suppliers, Siriti, took a mine that was previously owned by an Australian company in 2019. Part of that takeover means, or what was predicated on Eskom guaranteeing that they'll be paying 30% more than what they were paying the Australians for the same quantity and the same quality of coal. That is a problem.
So let's leave it there. There are a number of problems. They are layered there. I'm going to bring you back in on this conversation at a later stage. But because of time tonight, unfortunately, that's where we're going to have to leave it. Let me thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you very much.
That is Mametlwe Sebei, lecturer at the University of South Africa in the Department of Jurisprudence. He has looked at that Disaster Management Act and when it should be applied, only to be able to subvert the emergency procurement requirements, rather, shall we say. And saying, apart from that, there is no need for us to be on that particular framework. Well,